Today we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital.
Hello and welcome to Wide Angle This Week. Upending decades of America's Israel policy, its mercurial president, Donald Trump, announced that America was now going to be recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, a contested city, and we all know its history. What has led to this decision? What impact will it have on both the peace process and security in the Middle East? And how does it impact domestic politics in the US going forward? Joining us to talk about all of that, we have with us Alex Travelli, the Asia News editor for the Economist newspaper. Alex, thanks very much for being on Wide Angle with us. I think the first question, there has been tremendous popular support for this decision in the United States announced by Donald Trump, even though it's a landmark shift.
That's right, and it can be hard to understand maybe outside of America or outside the history of American policy on Israel and the Palestinians. But you have to remember that in general, pro-Israel positions are extremely popular among that part of the American public that cares at all. So to say wide support is not inaccurate, but it's a very concentrated support among those Americans who do pay attention. That includes both Americans who feel personally attached to Israel and also a huge swath of the red states, call them, who as evangelical Christians are committed to an idea that the Jews of Israel ought to have full possession of Israel. This has been the case for a long time, and Americans who aren't paying such close attention to the variety, to the long series of failed roadmaps and peace processes, might have missed the fact that that Jerusalem wasn't already recognized as the capital of Israel. It was in 1995, I think, that the American Congress voted by very wide margin, both parties, to force the president to recognize Jerusalem as the capital. The subsequent presidents, till now, have all refused to do that.
And so, therefore, you know, when you talk about the fact that there was a proposal, others have refused to act on it, what do you think made him go ahead and do it? Because there's been reasons for other presidents not to take that step and make a formal declaration.
And there are the same reasons, and perhaps even more, for Trump not to have done such a thing, to have refrained. It's too much of a puzzle to figure why he would have done this right now. I hope to learn at some point. I can think of a few reasons why this is an especially poorly chosen moment. But to look at what's in it for him, I think you have to look at the domestic consumption value. The fact that a lot of his supporters, who increasingly seem to be the only Americans he's really interested in governing for, will see this as being an end to a certain hypocrisy, the end to a fiction that might have been useful to American and other diplomacy, but which by now most of the American public, not to say the world's, knows is a fiction. That is to say that the Americans can play the neutral arbiter between Israel and the Palestinians.
So, in fact, that's my next question, Alex. To you as an American, I mean, the U.S. government, starting from '77 and Camp David and Jimmy Carter, I mean, there's been a history to America's role as mediator in the peace process, whether it's individually as the United States, whether it's part of a multinational grouping. What does this decision do to all those efforts, the ones that have gone past? What will it mean going forward, especially when many European allies of the United States have raised concerns about this announcement as well today?
Yeah, it would seem to junk all of that. It's not just a shift in American policy. It looks like a sort of poorly thought out last gasp or whatever comes after the last gasp, to presiding over or pretending to preside over a peace process involving both sides. And the significance of the capitals being moved is entirely symbolic in a way. It doesn't so much matter, you know, if an embassy is in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem as far as commuting or making meetings goes, or any practical considerations.
It's the symbolism of it.
It's the symbolism entirely. And to someone who's not paying close attention or enmeshed in the history of that symbolism, it might look to be worth very little. But this is a particular point that both sides and all of the American administrations, I think all foreign administrations, to be speaking to both sides, have agreed to postpone until the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves could hash it out. That America's given up on that now is something that would be very, very hard to imagine taking back in the future.
Also, it's an interesting time, not just its Western European allies, but Saudi Arabia too has been critical of this announcement. This just, weeks after the US has set up missile defense systems for Saudi Arabia to protect them from potential attacks from Iran. What does this do to the US role, the US relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is, it's playing itself out actively in the region right now? That's one part of the question. And the second is in terms of the security ramifications this would have overall on the Arab street. Are we looking at any reactions that we're worried about?
Well, the first question is, I think, the most fascinating. The American-Saudi relationship is in a very dynamic phase right now. It's hard to understand a lot of things about it, but the Trump administration in particular has shown itself to be very close to the Saudis at a time that both the Saudis and the Americans are ramping up tensions with Iran. It brings in Syria, Russia, the competition for greater influence in the region. And this is just like mud thrown in the face of the Saudis. The legitimacy of the Saudi kingdom has leaned heavily at times on its support for the Palestinian cause. To show its great new friend, the Trump administration, as giving up on that cause will be hard for them to stomach. And it's, of course, a very tumultuous time there right now with
the palace coup itself in Saudi Arabia, the way it's sort of dealing with Lebanon. Yeah,
the Crown Prince has enough on his plate. You'd think he'd rather not have to contend with. Yeah. But one suspects that wasn't taken into careful consideration in the Trump White House.
So, in Washington, very often, at least the sort of off-the-record conversations you have with bureaucrats, diplomats, there is always this sort of sense that while the president is mercurial and can be unpredictable, depending on what he feels like waking up in the morning and tweeting, there is a bureaucracy and a machinery and institutions that are at work and will ensure that systems are not damaged, policy is not tampered with, and yet you've seen this major tampering or upheaval of policy. The president is doing it on the basis of popular public support, but where does that leave foreign policy makers in Washington today?
Yeah, well, it's a terribly degraded position that they're in. We were talking about how, I think it's Reuters has an exclusive report. It seems to be a memo that was sent by part of the American State Department to their Israeli counterparts, asking them to please not, in other words, celebrate the decision to move the capital to the official recognition of the capital in Jerusalem, for fear that this will create security problems and presumably all kinds of other diplomatic problems. So those are the professional diplomatic corps trying to make the best of a difficult situation that they seem to be given by the political leadership. At the same time, you have to bear in mind that under the current Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, the number of embassies that's been left empty of ambassadors, deputy undersecretaries who haven't been named is enormous. I don't think that there's been such a staffing problem in America's State Department, ever, probably over the whole time period we're talking about. And there's even talk that now Tillerson will be replaced, maybe by the current CIA chief. So they have an unenviable juggling act to play at this point.
And yet, so therefore, does one see this decision and this announcement as them being really out of the loop and not relevant to foreign policy decisions now? Because, that's the message that's going out to the rest of the world, that it doesn't matter what the institutions and the bureaucracy have said all these years. I call the shots, I'm the president, and therefore what I say is what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, is this a blow against the bureaucrats, the diplomatic bureaucrats from the political leadership? It's hard to think that it isn't something like that. After all, the State Department is what's maintained continuity of American policy over the decades. When you see, for instance, these subsequent presidents of different parties, Clinton, Bush, Obama, all refusing to take Congress's lead and declare Jerusalem the capital, you have to understand that there's something about taking the office of the president and inheriting that bureaucracy and the historic momentum that comes with it that's restrained every previous president. Now something's changed. It would seem to be the president, not the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And we know already that there's a very hostile relationship between this president and
the administration. I mean, the
foreign
machinery,
service,
yeah, the foreign service. And also, I think what this does is, we started off talking about this, is the announcement really is in a sense taking off the veneer of neutrality that the United States has had, because the public support for this decision is, as you said, likely to be there as well, not just amongst his voters, but many people who might have just said, well, the United States has been tiptoeing around this for far too long, and this is what they've always believed. And so whether Jerusalem is holy to Judaism, Christianity and Islam is irrelevant, you know, let's go ahead and make the announcement.
I suspect that among those people, those Americans who care most about this matter, there's a great deal of jubilation that the decision has been made, and that would include a part of Trump's political base. Among the Americans who don't pay much attention to this saga, there might be something like a shrug, at least until the effects are felt. And it's very hard to see what those will be. You asked about security implications. Yeah. For a long time, there was a suspicion that the Arab street didn't really matter for all of the worrying about it. Yeah. But of course that period was before 2011. What the Arab Spring showed is that these leaders, even in the Gulf states, have to worry and do worry very much about what their citizens think about public issues. This is a great example of one that they'll have to worry about.
Right. Alex Travelli, thanks very much for giving us your time on Wide Angle. And as you said, I mean, let's see where the ramifications actually end up of a decision like this. It's a major announcement for U.S. foreign policy, and I think we'll have to just wait and see what the repercussions are. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome back. Continuing our discussion on President Donald Trump's announcement declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, talking about moving the U.S. embassy there over the course of the next few months. What impact does this have on world politics? How does India view this decision? Joining us to talk about that, I'm joined by Dr. Harsh Pant, the Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and Dr. Khinvraj Jangid, who runs the Center for Israel Studies at the Jindal Global University. Dr. Jangid, let me start with you actually. Since you've been conducting a seminar on Israel and Zionism in the capital as well this week, what is your reaction to this announcement? Is it just something that was a long time coming and needed to be said, or is it something that's going to be potentially extremely disruptive?
Thank you for giving this chance to talk about it. I think it's both. There's one particular way in which Trump put the matter is saying it is the acknowledgement of the obvious. I think Israel has operated since 1967, keeping Jerusalem as the seat of power. So as he said, the Knesset, the official residence and the offices of the president and the prime minister, they are all located in the city of Jerusalem. It's only that the international actors, all the international nation states have not opened their diplomatic missions there, realizing the relevance of the United Nations partition plan given in 1947, which actually declared Jerusalem to be an international city. Well, Jerusalem wasn't an international city when the 1948 war ended. The resolution didn't get implemented in any form. Largely from 1948 till 1967, the city of Jerusalem was under the Jordanian control. Right. Nobody uses the word occupation for it, but it is certainly occupation control, whichever way one would define politically. It's from 1967, Israel has taken the city under its firm control and has made a capital out of it. As Trump says, like any sovereign nation state, Israel should be entitled to determine its own capital. So I think what he has done is certainly acknowledging the obvious. Now, what are the problems of such an acknowledgement? There are plenty of them. I think to start with, I think one should look at the Palestinian cause, because that's the immediate casualty of any arbitrary or unilateral decision on the matter. There, I think Palestinians have lost a lot of hope and reliance to the American mediation, which was largely ceremonial but very important for the Oslo peace process from 1993 till 2001, Clinton parameters. It's a death of mediation. I don't think America will emerge again as any credible mediator. So the last part of it, in which he says, let me also say that America is still offers its facilitator's role to start the peace process whenever both the parties will seek American assistance.
Seriously now,
Palestinians will not take it, and I think largely whatever was achieved by Clinton parameters, I think Bill Clinton, whatever way he acted, he did invested a lot of his political capital into it, and Clinton parameter was almost an international reference to the two-state solution.
Right.
That's over today.
That's over today. Harsh, let me get you also in on this, because he's talking about the Palestinians now essentially having said or recognized this as really the end of all mediation on the peace process. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs obviously has been asked to respond to this and has issued a very simple one-line statement saying that the position on Palestine remains unchanged and it is determined by India's own interests. Can you tell us what that means, decode that statement for us?
Well, I think it's classic Indian speak on anything related to Middle East, as we have seen in the last for a long time. But I think partly that is understandable because we are looking at at a situation which we don't know the full implications of how they will unfold. I think a lot of the things that were earlier said. We don't exactly know, for all the sound and fury that is coming out, for example, from Saudis, ultimately what will happen. It looks like to me that there is a larger sort of a geopolitical dimension here, which is presenting a situation where the Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, who have been a long time allies of America, are basically looking at the region through the Iranian prism to an extent where perhaps this will be just a small fish in that larger context. So ultimately, whether you will have that kind of an Arab response to this, and therefore India's position becomes very critical, because India has for a long time been arguing that, look, our interests in the region are primarily Arab Gulf centric, because the kind of stakes that India has in the Arab Gulf, and in that sense, if there is an alignment between the Arab interest and the Israeli interest vis-a-vis Iran, that poses a dilemma for India to an extent that Iran is also now emerging as a credible actor vis-a-vis Afghanistan for India.
Right.
But largely, if you look at this sort of the basket of interest with regard to the Arab Gulf states and Israel, that's a pretty big basket.
Right.
So I think India will have to look at it very carefully in terms of how this unfolds. I think issuing an anodyne statement as they've done is part of our history, is part of our legacy, and also I think it's sort of an honest reflection on what the choices might be.
But okay, so taking that forward very quickly, and I'll bring you in on this as well in just a minute. Prime Minister Modi was the first Prime Minister to visit Israel, even though India and Israel opened diplomatic ties, in '94. Now, given that whole effort of building a friendship and a long-term association with Israel, where do you think, even if India is kind of being anodyne about its response on the Palestinian issue, where do you think it would be on the recognition of Jerusalem? I mean, can we separate the two?
See, ultimately we can't, but I think the issue, as I think again we have discussed earlier, is what does it actually mean in operational terms? It will take a few years, for example, for Americans themselves to shift this embassy, or for shift their embassy to Jerusalem, and I think the kind of sort of, we have to understand the sources of this change. The source of this change is pretty much domestic. I mean, Trump is responding to his right-wing sort of evangelical and conservative Jewish vote bank. And also, I think some perspective is in order, given that this there is an overwhelming bipartisan support in American Congress. Has always been
there
for Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. So I don't think in terms of the political trajectory within America we are looking at a massive sort of a disruptive change. It's only because of some practical issues that in 1995 when the Jerusalem Act was envisaged, Clinton decided was pushing back against it, not because he was not supporting the cause of Jerusalem being the capital, but he was simply saying that, look, take a step back, we have to get a two-state solution, and it may complicate that situation. Right. So the idea that you will have problems in operationalizing the two-state solution, the two-state model, that led to saying that, look, let's wait, let's not put the put more fuel to the fire. And so I think it's from the American perspective, this is more a domestic context in which they are looking at the problem. So perhaps while the answer to the question is that we can't separate the two out, but I think we are better off waiting and watching how this evolves, because I think there is much that will happen from now, even as the two sides start negotiating and how they move forward.
So following up on that is, this idea that he said that operationally, what does it really mean going forward? But I think the symbolism is what we're talking about much more than in operational terms. So, your views on that as far as India is concerned, and also, what do you think the security repercussions of something like this could be? I mean, could it provoke another spike in violence? What does it mean when you're already targeting and dealing with terror groups like ISIS in the neighborhood of Israel and Palestine, Hezbollah, Hamas? I mean, what does it mean to the security conflicts that are all around this city, actually?
Okay. I think the worrisome part is which way Hamas will react to it. Very recently, Hamas went into a unity government with Fatah, and this is a very rare moment where Hamas is actually reducing any amount of violence against the state of Israel. Hamas was almost about to come and reverse its charter, because Hamas charter does not recognize the state of Israel, the 1980s one. And a lot of persuasions happened that Hamas, like Yasser Arafat once upon a time, should come out and in public and say two things. It does recognize the state of Israel and its legitimacy in the West Asia. It does recognize the legitimacy of the two-state solution, and it does not call for religious radicalization of the conflict or the city of Jerusalem. So liberation of the whole of Palestine, as it used to be the motto of Hamas, with which it came into the national movement of Palestine, was supposed to be moderated now, that let's make Hamas more responsible. It's very interesting. Tony Blair has made two apologies after retiring from his office. It's unusual, but yes, he's the only British Prime Minister who has apologized twice about his office. So the first apology was lying about whole Iraq business with George Bush Jr. The second apology just came this year, saying that in 2006, when Hamas did win in the internal elections of the Palestinian people, conducted by the Indian Election Commission as well.
Correct.
Mr. Qureshi was one of the person who conducted it, and he said it was a credible election, Hamas won it, and Hamas should be recognized not as a terrorist group anymore. Tony Blair at that time went with the American propaganda, declared it as a terrorist organization. Now he said it was a big mistake, it was a blunder, which meant that there was a lot of persuasion that let's acknowledge Hamas, let's help modification of it, and legitimize it as a player. That effort is going to, I think, meet a very, very powerful antidote today, because now Hamas is very prone to go back to the religious slogans about the city of Jerusalem being completely taken from the Islamic heritage. Just 2 months back, there was a metal detector at the city plant, installed by the Israeli security establishment, created a lot of riots. They were removed then. A year back, there was a stabbing when the president of India was in Israel last year. Stabbing was one of the major international news. So this part of the world has seen a lot of vulnerabilities when it comes to security, and this is almost, as we say in Hindi, ghee and fire. I mean, it's fueling the fire. I think there's a very serious worry that third intifada. Now, intifada is the popular uprising that has been seen twice in the Palestinian national movement. The one which happened first was very non-violent because it did not attack the civilians.
So could this spark a third one, is what you're
saying?
Third
one. A lot of people thought that the stabbing was supposed to be the third intifada. It didn't happen.
Okay.
Will this be a third intifada? Well, it might be, because now there can be regional actors coming into it quickly. Hezbollah is no more an actor in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For them, Palestinian issue, as Professor Pant said, was a rhetoric. It has been a rhetoric for the Saudis, it has been rhetoric for many other Arab actors. Hezbollah is very much interested in now Lebanon. That's why there is no punches anymore.
Right.
It's only about Hamas. ISIS, I don't think, has a worry about anything. Israel has very capabilities to control that. It hasn't impacted any of the domestic elements. I don't think that will come to any problem.
So, Harsh, two questions from here. One is on these various groups and on the Saudi-Iran equation that we're seeing in terms of the security priorities of the entire region, of the entire Middle East region. And the second is, I think, perhaps maybe a more subjective question. You know, President Trump came in on the back of a popular move towards the right in American politics. The immigration ban was one of the first things he announced after becoming president. We're seeing across the world these sort of popular right-wing movements that are looking at Islamic extremism, Islamic radicalization as the biggest single security threat globally. In that entire global scenario, in that context, a decision like this, even though it may mean the end of mediation for Palestine, even though it may mean, you know, what happens to their aspirations, are people just inured and say it doesn't really matter anymore what the Palestinian thinks?
I think to a certain extent, yes. If you look at the opinion polls in America, they have they support 2-1 almost this decision. You know that. America should concede Jerusalem to Israel. So I think in terms of American domestic politics, this move towards a situation where this is almost irrelevant to their concerns at this point. And I think this is also true of the larger Western world. What we are witnessing in the larger Western world is this question about identity. You know, we are ordinary Brits, ordinary Germans, the rise of right-wing populist parties. I mean, this is a signal of a deeper malaise in these societies where the economic globalization seems to have been not reached out to certain quarters, and they are rebelling. They are protesting in their own ways. And so move towards right in that context becomes part of this larger global shift that we are witnessing. So I don't see they are going to be extremely concerned about what happens to the Palestinian cause. But I think the region will have to be concerned about, and as we have been discussing, the region itself has not been very, very faithful to the cause of the Palestinians. So it's almost as if, you know, the region has been using them, using the cause whenever it is needed. The real worry would be how will the Arab street, so-called Arab street, react? And there, the problems that we have been witnessing between the elites and the street over the last, you know, since the Arab Spring, I think they get accentuated. And if that happens, whether the elites will be in control of the streets. I mean, what Arab Spring has taught us is that, of course, you know, the elites have come back. The state has bounced back in some ways, but whether that can happen in the future as well, I think remains an open question. If this continues to then emphasize the importance of organizations like Hamas. Right. So I think that societal change that we are witnessing both in the West, where the cause has almost disappeared given the sort of internal turmoil, and in the Arab streets, I think that is the real issue for all of us to consider.
Right. Also, this comes at a time when President Trump is also talking about backtracking on the Iran nuclear deal, for example. You are actually creating a situation where the Middle East is thrown in the state of flux. There's an ongoing tension with Iran already. What do you think something like this could do to that?
Well, I think there are two things, and I think it's very important what you referred to, that this unilateralism that Trump, meaning American presidency largely post-Cold War, developed a certain amount of multilateral diplomatic efforts, except George Bush the Jr. The greatest American legitimacy and the over-influence happened after the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was deterred, and later he was removed from the invasion of Kuwait. That gave America, the H.W. Bush, the senior, and James Baker, they claimed the new world order in the Middle East, because it was a great time for the American diplomacy, and America was considered a very legitimate player. And America did succeed in getting Jordan sign a full peace treaty with Israel in 1994. This presidency, I think, is reversing all of those efforts. I think Barack Obama was quite critical in making the world multilateral. I mean, to me personally, he conceived the world to be a better world with multipolarity than unipolarity or hegemony. But I think Trump, and I think what Professor Pant said, it has to do with this domestic political philosophy of the Republican Party, a very neoconservative, aggressive, interventionist, unilateral view of the world.
Right.
So what he did, exactly what you referred to, in the Iranian matter, he in fact went and said, I will undo this mistake.
Yeah.
That's a Republican dumping the democratic principles. So it's a worrisome thing. And I think to a certain extent, if I can use the word, it's a recklessness. So it's a unilateralism which is on a rise from the American point of view. And the rest of the international players are going to mobilize other way, form an alliance to deter this unilateralism, and which is obviously coming out in many pockets.
So Harsh, as a final question, given these various developments that we're seeing, what do you think? I mean, India will obviously, on the basis of its statement, act in its own national interest. But what do you think Indian national interest should right now be, given the flux in the Middle East, given the belligerence from the US on Iran, given the way the Saudis have reacted to this development, given the reaching out to Israel, what should India do?
Well, I think there has been a consistency in Indian position on the larger West Asian, Middle Eastern sort of situation for some time now. And I don't see India departing very significantly from that position, even under these very trying circumstances. And I think that has been this idea that, look, India is favorably positioned to take advantage of the three main pillars in the region, Iran being one, GCC being the other, or Arab Gulf states being the other, and Israel being the third one. And we have sort of, made our way through these three major actors. And whether it was the Manmohan Singh government or whether it is this government, and this government has been, the big change has been with regard to Israel, the open embrace of Netanyahu has been the one change. But other than that, if you look carefully, there has been a continuity in India's foreign policy in that regard. I don't see that changing, because if we have just had the Chabahar inauguration. So I don't see that changing. I think the real problem for India would be if the role of America as a neutral peacemaker or a dealer peacemaker of this peace settlement gets reduced, and you have China and Russia filling in that vacuum, then where does India fit in?
Right.
And I think that will be a challenge that India will have to consider in a context where, as I said earlier, you will see, or we might end up seeing, a growing Israeli-American-Saudi nexus in terms of managing Iran's, what they perceive as a resurgence.
And this is in spite of the fact the Saudis have condemned or criticized this recent move.
So because we'll have to see how this, this condemnation translates into policy. Because for them the larger threat is clearly now, if you look at the new prince's, his ambitions for Saudis and his policies. I mean, some of them are very nutty policies, but I think the policies are a reflection of his concern about Iran.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, I think you want to come in on this idea that if there is a vacuum left by the United States, that countries like Russia and China fill. Russia is already playing a role as far as the Syrian crisis is concerned. Where does that leave India in terms of its geostrategic importance for the Middle East?
Not to further that point, I think I had something else to add, which is that this maybe, and it's interesting to think, maybe this is a time when this delegitimization of the America has reached to its final realization. that let's acknowledge are obvious. That America is no more that legit relevant player anymore. America has its own mess. America has become irrelevant in many ways. So maybe there would be a new order in the Middle East which will later emerge as a new world order.
So to take President Trump's words, acknowledging the obvious?
Yeah, that let's not even bother about what America says today.
Yeah.
We might be overstretching America's statements. It's important to contextualize the departure and the major diplomatic choices,
Right.
but it might be worth thinking that, well, this is one of the last
But
days.
just if I may take
Yeah.
a slightly contrarian view and suggest that, you know, when you talk of a peace settlement, I think the kind of you need engagement from both sides.
Right.
And I don't think there is any other country that can put Israelis on the mat the way Americans can. And I would be very surprised if that role is tomorrow played by Chinese or the Russians. I don't see that happening. So I think structurally the peace process still depends on the American benevolence to a certain extent. Now whether or not they play that card remains to be seen.
And also whether or not the other side comes to the table, given the situation right now.
So I think
we'll have to leave it at that. But I think very important points raised by both of you, and certainly for us sitting in Delhi, looking at these developments taking place in the Middle East, wondering just exactly which way the chips will fall. As Harsh Pant, you pointed out, the MEA statement anodyne, but essentially a wait and watch approach, which is what Indian foreign policy very often seems to fall back on. But that's all we have on Wide Angle this week. Thanks for watching.